So we are honored and blessed this morning to have a special speaker with us, all the way from China, I don't know, yeah, halfway around the world. Eugene Bach leads an organization called Back to Jerusalem, and they are a large part of the underground church in China with ministries in Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, like all over the place. Anywhere you shouldn't be, that's where they are. And so would you give Eugene a hand as he comes this morning?
I took the detour. Good morning. That was a really special service, but I have to admit that I have a soft spot for the violin, so whenever I see the violin being played, I only say violin in proper settings. I usually say fiddle. My oldest son, who's now a senior in university here in the U.S., he was the only banjo player in all of Hong Kong, so the one thing that he was missing was a violin, a fiddle. So in China, where I've lived for the last over 20 years, we believe in arranged marriages. So if I find a young girl that plays the violin, I might make a deal with the parents for my son. I'm just joking. You don't have to blush. Not really. I'm always a little nervous whenever I speak in Jewish services like this, because one of my best friends is a guy by the name of Rabbi Miles Weiss. And so I went to him and I asked him one time, I said, brother, I was speaking in front of a synagogue, and I said, what should I not say? And he goes, what do you mean? I was like, well, I don't want to offend anybody. And he goes, brother, if they're real Jews, you will not offend anybody. If there's two of them together, you're going to have at least 3 opinions. So don't worry about it. And I said, well, how will I know if they like me? And he said, if they really like you, they will disagree with you. I said, really? So what happens if they agree with me? And he goes, they won't agree with you. If they agree with you, that's how you know they don't like you. I said, but that doesn't make any sense to me. And he goes, yeah, actually it does, because they don't like you, they don't want to spend time with you, so they're not going to argue with you, and they will leave you. So I was very happy for that advice. I remember we were traveling into China. I took him to China, Rabbi Miles Weiss, into China for the very first time. He had never been to China before. And somehow he ended up giving me a tour of China. I took him to Shanghai. I've been living in China for over 20 years. I travel a lot inside of China. I did not know that there was this Holocaust memorial in Shanghai, and that there was this massive place where several thousand Jews were rounded up and had to live there until 1949, when they were sent to Israel from Shanghai. And he gave me a tour. I said, brother, this is the first time I've ever been with somebody in China that was not Chinese that gave me a tour. But I really felt that there was something with him being there that brought alive much of what I see inside of China. If I want to say that I want to understand my faith a little bit better, and if I tell this group that I think to understand my faith a little bit better, I need to really study the faith of the one that I follow, Judaism. I think many people here would say amen. That sounds like someone agreed with me. But as I think about my following after Christ, I have to say that's who I am. So if I want to learn who I am, to study the Jewish culture and the Jewish language and the Jewish religion, I think that would also explain a little bit about who I am. And that might make sense. But what if I told you that for me to better understand China, I had to study Judaism? That sounds like I went to American public schools to study geography. Like, that doesn't sound like it's possible. But I want to just take a few moments to share some things with you about China. I've been living and serving inside of China for like I said, over 20 years. I know that you can't tell by looking at me, but I'm not Chinese. So I can't tell you about the underground house church from a Chinese perspective. I can only tell you about what's happening in China as an observer, someone who has been in China. And the longer I am in China, honestly, the less I understand. But as an observer, someone who has lived in China for over 20 years, one of the things that I have seen is that in their history, there are some remarkable things that I think you guys might get a little bit excited about. I have been studying the Chinese history for a long time. In fact, when I travel to certain areas of China, I give Chinese tours of certain places inside of China and give even tour guides a tour of certain areas of China. Because much of what is in China today, not a lot of people understand. Why? Because China's history is very long, and much of it has been destroyed in the last 70 years. In the last 70 years, much of their history has been destroyed for one specific reason, I believe. And that is because the enemy did not want the Chinese to know their real history. You know, if you look at Chinese history, and we don't have enough time to go through that today, but if you look at Chinese history, it's about as long as the Jewish history. It's about 5,000 years long is how far they can trace back their history. And like the Hebrew language, the Chinese language is one of the oldest languages in the world. Trust me when I say it's not an easy language to learn. In the English language, we have about 26 characters, like A through Z. In China, we have about 20,000. And each one of those characters tell a story. Now, many of the Chinese, when they learned how to write their own characters, they learned how to write by repeating after the teacher. They were just dogmatically taking information, processing it, and trying to learn it so that they could get a good grade. Never really stopping and asking, what do these different symbols mean and where did they come from? If you look at the Chinese history that goes back 5,000 years, you're going to find something very exciting. And that is this. There is something about the God that they followed in the early days of the Chinese that has been lost, but is now starting to come back. Now, when most of you think of Chinese or the Chinese culture or the Chinese religion, many of you might think of the Chinese as being Taoist, Confucianist. Most recently, because of communism, atheists, Buddhists, but never as Christians. Never as Jews. I mean, most people would never say that there's any connection between Chinese and Jews. I had a friend with me, and I was sharing with him about a guy who had come to China with his pastor, and they were wondering in China if there were any Chinese Jews at all. So they decided one morning at their breakfast to ask the waiter, "Excuse me, sir." They said, "Do you know, is there any Chinese Jews here?" And he said, "I don't know. Let me go and ask the cook." So he comes back and he says, "No, I'm sorry, we have no Chinese Jews. We have orange juice, apple juice, fruit juice, but no Chinese juice." But as we start looking at the Chinese history, if you think of them as being Taoist, Confucianist, Buddhist, those religions only go back to the 2nd century BC. So now you have about 2,500 years, 2,500 years of time where the Chinese followed another religion that was not Buddhism, that was not Taoism, that was not Confucianism. So what was it? Well, we have some historians that have written about the very first emperor of China. That was almost 5,000 years ago. Huangdi is one of, ask any Chinese who the very first emperor is, and they will respond, it was Huangdi. He's considered to be the founder of the Chinese people. And then you start to try to ask more about him, and if you go back that far in time, you come to a place where we as believers have to be very honest with ourselves. Because if we believe in the Bible, and I do, if we believe in the Bible, then we have to accept the book of Genesis as being true. And if we accept the book of Genesis as being true, we see a timeline right after Shem, Ham, and Japheth at the founding of China. And if it's true that Huangdi, the original founder of China, had been exposed to at least the children of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, then it could also be true that he might have heard some of the stories shared by Noah. Right? So I start looking, and I've written a book. We have a couple of books that we have brought here. They're for donation only. Any donation you give, you take whatever books you want. If you don't have a donation to give, you take the books with you anyway. We want to make a deposit into your life about what is happening in China so that you will take this with you and pray long after I'm gone. But one of the things that I discovered is Huangdi gave a sacrifice to the god of Shangdi. Shangdi is the name of the ancient god of China. What is fascinating about that for me is that when I pray together with my brothers and sisters in China, guess how we refer to God? Shangdi. Shangdi, you know, the Chinese language is pictorial. Like it paints a picture in some cases. In some cases, it is more phonetic, where it makes a sound that's close to what the Chinese are saying. For instance, if I fly to a city called Losenji, what city do you think I'm flying to? Los Angeles. Jijiaga, Chicago. So if I fly, so they try to find characters that are maybe not perfect. My name in Chinese, Eugene. So they try to find those characters that are close to the sound that they're trying to make. It's not always perfect because it's not phonetically adaptive in the way that English is with the sounds that we have. Though there were a couple sounds this morning that I heard that I don't know if we have English letters to represent those sounds. But as I'm sitting here and I'm looking at this name of Shangdi, I start asking, where does this come from? And I learned that this is close to the original word of Shaddai. So this word of Shangdi, the god that the Chinese originally praised, this sounds very close to that word Shaddai. Coincidence? But I want you to listen as I read from the very first prayer of Huangdi when he would make a sacrifice at Taishan, which is one of the holiest mountains in all of China. When he would make a sacrifice to this mountain, he would go to the God that created all things. And this is the prayer that was prayed by Huangdi according to Chinese historians. Tell me if it reminds you of anything that you've heard before. In the beginning, God created the earth and the heavens. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, you will have heard that because I read that from Genesis. He said this, it was this one. Of old, in the beginning, there was great chaos without form and dark. The 5 elements had not begun to revolve, nor the sun and the moon to shine. In the midst thereof, there existed neither form nor sound. Thou, O spiritual sovereign, came forth in thy presidency, and first did divide the grosser parts from the pure. Thou made heaven, thou made earth, thou made man. All things with their reproducing power got their being from you. When I read that, one of the reasons why I went to the wrong area and started reading from the comparison to Genesis is because it's so close to Genesis 1. As I continue to look at this 5,000-year history, I'm completely blown away. Has anybody here ever been to Beijing? Okay, so I can completely make this up and you won't know. In Beijing, if you ever get a chance to go, don't go now because there's COVID. When I traveled in January of 2020, I came to the U.S. directly from Wuhan, and then to Europe, and then to Asia. So I might actually be directly responsible for the spread of the virus. But when China's open, if you can go to Beijing, they left one cultural relic that is still there. It's called the Temple of Heaven. And if you get a chance to go there, it's fascinating. The tourists are everywhere. And when I first went, I went together with a tour group, and it seemed like Chinese history. Nothing special. But as I started to dig further, I saw something that I recognized. I traveled together with a pastor friend of mine. He runs a little small church in China of only about 10 million believers. I have actually his story where he shares even more personally. It said, I stand with Christ, how he went from being one of the most well-known communist official members in China to being the most well-known pastor in all of China today. He took me on a tour of the Temple of Heaven that I will never forget. You see, when you go into the Temple of Heaven with naked eyes, you just see this Chinese temple where ancient practices of sacrifice took place. But as you begin to pay attention to the patterns, you realize everything is built in threes. The altar is built in 3 levels. There is the first altar that you come to, there's a bridge, and then there's a second altar. In the sacrificial temples, everything has 3 levels, representing this idea of almost like a trinity. Now, I've been living in China for a long time, and I can tell you that all of the Chinese gods are plastered everywhere. And everywhere you go, in every home that you go into, you always see these different Chinese altars where fruit is given. My youngest son had a problem walking past certain homes when we lived in a small village and not taking fruit and taking a bite out of it because he was 1 and thought it looked good. But all of these Chinese homes that were always around me, they always had these small little altars and pictures of their gods. And so you see them everywhere, representation of who that God is. But I've been to the Temple of Heaven many, many times, and there's not one image of God. Why? Because Shangdi does not want his image to be mounted anywhere in that temple. So I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, okay, this is fascinating. And then I see that there's an outer courts and an inner court and a holy of holies. I start studying the way that they do their sacrifices, and I'm like, where did this come from? Because it looks Levitical. Then the most amazing thing was revealed to me when I learned about the sacrifice that the emperor made every year. You see, the emperor was representing the Chinese people. And when he would come into the outer courts, everybody would be around him and they would be together with him, and there were these big processions that would bring him in. And then there was a sacrifice that would take place. And then there was this place that's called the gates of hell. And it's called the gates of hell because once you go past it, you don't return. And from the first altar to the final altar, where the final altar is where only the emperor can make a sacrifice, there's a bridge, and you have to cross that bridge, and only the emperor can do it by himself. And so the emperor by himself makes a sacrifice on the other side of that bridge, and that's where the big temple is. But that's not what fascinated me. What fascinated me was the emperor goes into the gates of hell. He stops on the side of the bridge, and for 3 days and 3 nights, he fasts. And on the 3rd day, he rises back up and makes the final sacrifice. When I saw that, I thought, this is not by coincidence. It can't be by coincidence. There's simply no way that can be something that just kind of matches up a little bit with the Bible that I have grown to love. As I continue looking at the Chinese language and the Chinese culture and the Chinese history. One of the things, I didn't bring any slides, and I don't have a dry erase board, and even if I did have a dry erase board, my Chinese sucks, so I could try to draw them for you, but anybody here that speaks Chinese or reads Chinese would be embarrassed of the way that I write Chinese. I'm pretty good at writing Chinese on my phone, but with a pen, not so much. But as I look at the Chinese characters, I'm blown away at the stories that they tell. You know, it's possible for me to tell almost the entire story of Genesis just using Chinese characters. For instance, the word for good, it's one of the most well-used words in the entire Chinese language, has two characters that are a part of it. So to make up this one Chinese character, you have to have two characters that you bring together. The character for man and the character for woman. You bring them together, and that's good. You look at Genesis, God made man and woman and saw that it was good. Okay, that's stretching it. Maybe I'm just making this up. But then you start seeing other things. The word for boat in Chinese. Do you remember the first boat that we see in the Bible? The ark, right? The word for boat is 8 people on a vessel. How many people were on Noah's ark? Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their 3 wives. Okay, now it's starting to get a little bit more. There's some coincidences here that almost, give you a little bit of chills. Like, is this real? Then you start looking at other ones. Here's a good one. The word for brother in Chinese and the word for murderer is the same. It's pronounced the same. Xiong is the word that we use for murderer, and it's the word that we use for brother. But they're written differently. You see, the word for brother is the body of a man and a head. The word for murderer is the body of a man and a head with a mark. Think about the very first murder that we see in the Bible. When you start seeing that, it's like, what is going on here? When we see the word for deceiver, then it gets even better. The word for deceiver is the devil in the garden telling a secret to man. When I look at the word for righteousness, the word for righteousness is a lamb over me. When we look at this, that was the response I was hoping to get in this congregation. I almost want to talk faster than I am because I'm like a kid that just bought a gift for somebody else and they're not opening it fast enough, and I want to rip it open so they can see what's on the inside because I got excited about this. Why? Because I know that the Word of God is true and it's only confirmed in other cultures. And when I'm preaching about Jesus Christ in China, I'm not bringing to them a foreign God. I can tell them, dude, your country was serving God thousands of years before my culture even existed. I'm not bringing to you a foreign God. I'm bringing back to you the original love that you had. What's the biggest holiday in the Jewish calendar? Yom Kippur. What's another one? The Passover, right? If we look at the largest holiday of the year, does anybody know what the largest holiday of the year is in China? Chinese New Year. Yeah, that's it. Chinese New Year. Do you know what Chinese New Year is based on? The lunar calendar. Do you know why Easter comes at a different time every year? It's based on the lunar calendar. That's also marked by the equinox, which means the equal division of night and day. When you look at that equal division of equinox for both the Chinese and the Jews, it means something significant for harvest seasons. So you have this kind of holiday that happens around the same time, not the same day, but around the same time, based on the same ideas. For Chinese New Year, do you know what they do to celebrate? They put red banners to protect their house over their doors, over the doorposts of their doors, so the evil spirits will pass by. Ask 20 different intellectuals what those red banners mean, and they will give you 20 different answers. Because nobody really knows. But I know. Why? Because the deeper I dig into God's Word, the more I start to understand that God has revealed Himself to so many different people and cultures. What makes the Jews different? Because they carried this vessel and kept it pure. While other vessels were getting polluted, there was this one vessel that was carried and given to the world. The verse that was read this morning from Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, I think is absolutely important for what we call the back to Jerusalem vision, which is, I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you, I will curse. This is a spiritual law. And when we see nations rising up against God's people, it's only a matter of time before they fall. When we see nations blessing God's people, we see that they are blessed. Guys, I spent most of last night in a service where I went way too long and spoke way too much about the rise and fall of nations, blessing or cursing God's people. So as I'm looking at this Chinese history, I am fascinated because as we look at the vision that they have today, if you don't know, allow me to be the one to share the news with you. Today in China, we are having the world's largest revival. It's not even close to anywhere else. About 28,000 to 30,000 people coming to Christ every single day. With that number of people coming to Christ, they have a vision to send out at least 100,000 missionaries to preach the gospel into the areas between China and Jerusalem. Why is this area significant? For us, it's everything that has to do with Matthew chapter 24:14. If you say that you love Christ, right, you're going to want to see the return of the Messiah. Am I wrong? Like, if you really love him. Like, when I first started dating my wife, I was in the U.S. military. I was in the Marine Corps, stationed at Camp Pendleton. My wife was going to school in Orange County, and anybody that knows that road there with the 405, it is horrible. And so I'd be bumper to bumper every day. When I first met my wife, I was so in love. And I'd be the first one out of formation in my car driving to her campus. And when I got to her campus, time flew by. It'd be 3 o'clock in the morning, almost 4 o'clock in the morning. I realized I have to get back for like 5 o'clock formation. So I would drive, no sleep, trying to keep myself awake as I'm driving, singing as loud as I can. And once I got into formation, I'm telling you, I went all day dragging, begging for just a moment of sleep. Like, I can't wait till this day is over so I can go straight to bed. As soon as the day was over, my energy was back, and all I could think about was going up and seeing her. I wanted to be in that car, and I didn't care what I missed out on. I wanted to see her. I believe that if we are truly in love with Christ, we're going to want to be with him. We are going to want his return. We're going to want him to come back for us. And Jesus said when he would come back, he said it very clearly. When this gospel of the kingdom is preached to all the nations, then the end will come. Or how are we doing on that commitment? When Jesus, the very last words out of his mouth, if you think about somebody that's dying, after you say your goodbyes, after you say all of the things that you wanted to say in terms of like I love yous, what is the last phrase that you would want to say to leave people with, knowing that this was important for you? We have that with Jesus. Before he ascended, Acts 1:8, he shares with his disciples the very verse that we call the Great Commission. To take the good news to all the world. That's what we have been called to do. How are we doing on that? The area between China and Jerusalem is the area where we have 2/3 of the world's population. 2 out of every 3 people that are born in the world today are born between China and Jerusalem. It is also the area where we have 9/10 of those that have never heard the gospel even one time. Out of every $100 given to missions in America, only 2 pennies goes to reach the unreached. Only 1 penny goes to reach the area between China and Jerusalem. Do we really have a strong focus to complete the Great Commission? What resources are we putting behind it? What motivation do we have to complete it? When we look at this area between China and Jerusalem, the Chinese are not just focusing on what we call the final frontier of missions. They believe that God has had a plan from the very beginning. And that plan started on the Mount of Olives when Jesus gave the Great Commission to his disciples. Now, this might be the area where you will disagree a little bit, but just give me a couple of minutes and explain what the Chinese vision is of back to Jerusalem. Because it's basically the Great Commission. We say it's the Great Commission with Kung Pao flavor. This idea of back to Jerusalem starts on the Mount of Olives in Acts chapter 1. From there, we see that the author of the book of Acts follows the disciples. Where? To Jerusalem. That's a westward movement. If anybody here has ever been to Jerusalem, If you are on the Mount of Olives, if you go to the other side of the Mount of Olives, to the eastern side of the Mount of Olives, you're no longer in the Mount of Olives. You're in an area that they thought could have been Bethany, but it's no longer the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives is on the side that is facing the temple. And when you are on the Mount of Olives, you are by default facing the east gate. The east gate is facing east, China. So the east gate is called the east gate because it's facing east. And when you see the east gate from the Mount of Olives, it's one of the most prominent figures that you can see from the Mount of Olives. It's not that far; it's pretty close. And when you go from, and it's referred to as a Sabbath day's walk from the Mount of Olives to Jerusalem, which is a westward movement. Now, how many people here believe that God doesn't tell a lie? I don't know if he's never told a lie. I just know that if it wasn't true before he said it, it is true after he said it, because his words create. His words have the power to create. God doesn't just merely speak. He creates when he speaks. Everything that has its life got its life from his word as he spoke. When we see Jesus giving the Great Commission to his disciples, by default, he's facing the east gate. I believe he already put the direction of the gospel in place at that time. What happens from there is you have the disciples that go from the Mount of Olives to Jerusalem. While they're in Jerusalem, we see that the writer of the book of Acts begins to narrow in from the disciples into one disciple, Peter. From there, we see that Peter goes from Jerusalem and starts to move westward all the way to the most western edge of all of Israel, which is Joppa. Joppa's right there on the sea. So he gets to the very western edge, and there we have this vision that is given to him. And with that vision that is given to him, there is a transition that takes place almost immediately after. In chapter 10, we see this transition start to begin, where there's another figure that is brought into play, Paul. And Paul goes west, goes into Asia Minor, and he preaches all the way to the edge of the sea in Turkey. And when he gets to this place called Troas, he's there in chapter 16. He's reached the end, and now he faces back towards Asia. And I believe if he would have gone that way from Troas towards China, China would have been reached 2,000 years ago. But chapter 16 says something happens. He is stopped by the Holy Spirit. Why, I don't know. He tries to go north to Bithynia. He's stopped again. And then he has a vision of a man from Europe, Macedonia. And then he goes into Europe. We see this Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the rest of the world, this pattern, this map that's laid out with the power of the words of Christ. And so there were disciples that went east. I was just in Iraq last month, where we see the very first Christian kingdom that was established by St. Jude. That we call him Jude, not Judas, so that we don't confuse the two. But he also had Bartholomew, Thaddeus with him. So we see the very first Christian kingdom that takes place very near the modern city of Arbil. So there were missionaries that went east. Thomas went all the way to India. I remember I was in Chennai one time, and I went for a run. And I went up to this mountain, and I saw this beautiful church. I was stunned. I went up, and I asked, is this a Catholic church? And they're like, oh, no, this is a church that is built in honor of St. Thomas. I was like, oh, was he a missionary? And they're like, no, St. Thomas. I was like, oh, you mean Doubting Thomas? They said, yeah, in India, we don't call him Doubting Thomas, because he came and gave his heart, gave his life so that we could hear the good news. And this is to remember that Thomas came to India. So we had disciples that went east, but it didn't take root in the same way. We have these revivals that take place in Jerusalem, in Asia Minor, Europe, Africa. And then from Africa and Europe around to the Americas, where we had two great awakenings. Today, the largest revival is taking place in China. The largest church is in South Korea. That wave has continued on. And now there's this final frontier between China and Jerusalem where the gospel has not yet gone. As I look at that vision of the Chinese church, I ask myself, Okay, I'm excited about this. It's not bad, right, to have that idea and go preaching the gospel westward. But is it exactly biblical theology that can be defended? Then I start seeing the Old Testament. This idea that God is always approached from east to west. For instance, Adam and Eve, when they sinned against God and they were pushed away from the presence of God, there was only one guard that was set in station to the east of the garden. So that if the people tried to approach the garden again, they would be blocked. And when Cain kills his brother, he's pushed further away from the presence of God, pushed further east. And I can go all day long with this kind of focus, but there's one that blows me away. If you follow the temple only has one entrance. It's the same as the exit. There's no fire exit in the temple. So you go in from the east, and you approach the Holy of Holies, which is in the west. That's why today we still have the prayer at the western wall. So you have this approach to God from east to west. You know, even the sun itself rises in the east and sets in the west. And as it rises at the time of the Passover festival, is it when the sun rises exactly over the Mount of Olives, illuminates the temple directly from the east. That way it's most illuminated throughout the entire than it is at any other time of the year. By accident? You think God just said, you know what, I think this looks like a good design. During that time, all of the pagan temples were mainly built north and south, not east and west. When you look at not just that, but the preparation of the priests, the sacrifices that would take place on the Mount of Olives, the animals would face from east to west. The slicing of those animals went from east to west. And the priests themselves would go from the Mount of Olives over what's called the Red Heifer Bridge back to Jerusalem from east to west. So what the Chinese are doing is not unique. It's actually patterned after the very Bible that we embrace. And I couldn't be more excited. Because what's happening right now is as the Chinese rise up and they have this vision, take the gospel back to Jerusalem, they are joining together with you and me. I'm not telling you about a mission that they're on by themselves. I'm telling you that as warriors of Christ, we now have fellow soldiers jumping in the trenches with us that are willing to stand shoulder to shoulder to complete the Great Commission. And what's amazing is what God is doing inside of China today. Because it's not just about the number of people that are coming to Christ. The sheer number alone, it's amazing. But when you see how God is using them in countries that are generally closed to the good news of Jesus Christ, you can't help but to be in awe of how God designed it all. You see, China shares a border with India, Nepal, Afghanistan, Pakistan. China is the largest trading partner in the world for North Korea, Iran, Somalia, Sudan. There are these countries that are aggressive against Christ and his word being preached, and yet God has opened up a door with the Chinese with one of the largest investments that has ever been seen as what's called the One Belt, One Road investment, where the government is actually preparing the way for the very Christians that they persecute. By making investments, providing opportunities and platforms for Chinese to go in, get jobs, and preach the good news. And one of the things that the Chinese blow me away with is that what they have learned through their persecution to share the gospel in closed countries. One of the things that I do is I work together with the Chinese to start up jobs and platforms in closed countries. Places like North Korea, places like Iran, where I travel to on a regular basis. I can remember when I traveled for the very first time into Iraq. I took a pastor with me that had about 4 million believers in his church. And we had handed out all of this gear to those that were hit hard, the hardest by ISIS. We had handed out oil and food and blankets. And I remember at the end of the evening, we hiked up to the top of this mountain after our workday was done, and we sat up there together. And from where we were at, we could see the ISIS headquarters. This is around 2015. And we could see the ISIS headquarters. We could see the lights. We could see Mosul Dam Lake. And I remember him saying to me, what are we doing to bring the gospel to ISIS? That's not where I was in my mind. The persecution that he had gone through brought him there faster than my mind was able to go. Because my background, I was a scout sniper in the U.S. Marine Corps. I did 2 tours in the Persian Gulf. I had a top 10 list of the things I wanted to deliver to ISIS, and the gospel was not among them. But as he began to talk about bringing the good news to ISIS, what if there's a Paul that is yet to have his Damascus experience? What if, instead of trying to transform the culture from the outside in, we see it change with the gospel from the inside out? What if, instead of sending soldiers, God's people begin to send missionaries that are willing to sacrifice their life, not for death, but to give life? What if, instead of sending bombs, we as believers begin to send Bibles? So we began to work together, and we created this little device that we call the Back to Jerusalem pill-size hologram Bible, so we could deliver this inside of ISIS territory. This little hologram Bible is something that you can hold into your hand. It has Genesis through Revelation, and it illuminates the air in front of your face, and you can read the entire Bible. We were able to come up and invent this with Back to Jerusalem so that we could deliver this to the people that God had called us to preach the good news to. These kind of devices we are putting together every single year with the Chinese. The great thing about China is we make almost everything. So if there's something that doesn't exist and we need it, we can invent it. I got another tool that I would love to share with you guys. I will do that after this time for those of you that would like to talk a little bit more. We have a device that we call Operation Black Trumpet, and it is helping us deliver the good news to Afghanistan right now while it's under Taliban control. This is one of the amazing things about partnering together with the Chinese and the vision that God has given them. They're not replacing us. They're not. You have to understand that the Chinese going out as missionaries is not this idea of subcontracting the Great Commission. They are joining together with us. So I come today as a representative from China. I ask that you continue to pray for us, continue to pray for the vision that is taking place. And before we leave, any children that are here, we want to give a small gift. This is what we call the Back to Jerusalem Prayer Bear. And we ask that children put this in a place where they can see it, that every day when you are together with your children, may this be a reminder to pray for the persecuted church in China and the persecuted church outside of China. These specific prayer bears were handmade by some women that we worked together with in Iraq. And each one of them that made them by hand puts their name on the inside, so that you know the name of the person that made those. And we pray that they will be reminded for you when you pray for the persecuted church. So I want to thank you so much. Judy, I want to thank you for the Facebook message. Said, hey, you're in the area. Would you be able to stop by? I really appreciate it. I was humbled by the invitation. I love being here with you guys. And I pray that please continue to pray for the persecuted church, the Chinese church, and know that the Great Commission is being completed, and I believe it can be completed in our lifetime. Thank you so much. Thank you.